I have stolen a camera. And that's the best thing I could do. And the camera in question is this old Nikon D5100, which I still own to this day. This camera introduced me to the world of DSLRs and changing lenses, buying equipment, editing RAW, and I'm very grateful for it. But from the start, how did this camera ended up in my possession? Well, it was almost 10 years ago, where my mom wanted a good camera to take on vacation and take photos of my brother and her family. And without knowing anything about cameras, she bought a small DSLR with 2 lenses, but she only used one all the time. And you guessed it, the camera in question was this old Nikon. Despite having an expensive camera, trust me, this camera was quite expensive back in the day, she didn't know anything about DSLRs. And she used only the automatic mode of this camera. Don't get me wrong, using the automatic mode of your camera isn't a bad thing in general, especially if you're a beginner photographer or you need to take photos that just work. But one day she came home bragging about that this camera doesn't work and her vacation album is ruined. Well, the truth is the camera worked perfectly fine. The thing was, she didn't know any better. She didn't know that the camera has to focus first, that you have to half press the button first and then it takes an image. She also didn't know that this camera doesn't take images when there's no SD card inserted, because this camera doesn't have internal storage. And she researched a bit about cameras, and everyone told her a DSLR is the best camera you can get. Not this particular DSLR, just a DSLR. So she bought this Nikon without knowing how to use it. And she took about 700 photos on a weekend on her vacation, and when I looked through them, I could delete almost 500 immediately, because they were all blurry, grainy, or just too dark, or too bright. Why? Because she didn't research this particular camera. And to be honest, the low light capabilities of the Nikon 5100 are not the best. The problem was that I tried to teach her how to use this camera, but it wasn't my teaching. It was the fact that she only used this camera maybe once or twice a year, so she quickly forgot how to use this camera. This was the time where I actually played around with the camera a bit, because the camera I owned before was a Fujifilm Finepix S200, I believe. It had a ridiculous telezoom lens and I loved it. But I asked her if I could use it and work for my project. She agreed, and every time I came home, this camera ended up in my room. And then I moved out. And without even realizing, I accidentally packed the camera with me. And since I had a lot to do back then, and let's be honest, I was quite lazy back in the day, I didn't open all the boxes immediately. And after a few weeks went by and I opened the last box, I found the camera inside the box, and I didn't even realize that I have it for such a long time. I wasn't the owner of the camera, but on the other hand, I was able to use it. So I decided to keep it, and I bought new equipment like the SB600. This small Nikon 5100 laid the first milestone of my photography business and photography journey. And I was able to compete in small photography contests, work with raw files for the first time. I was able to earn money with this small camera. And I have to admit that I have a small love-hate relationship with this camera, because I really hate the size and that is so small. The autofocus of the camera was mediocre. The low light capabilities were okay, and it is a relatively slow camera for what I did back in the day. But I still have it, and we went through a lot, like you can see. The viewfinder is broken, I crashed the lens I had before. You may be asking, didn't your mother realize that the camera is missing? Well, the truth is, she realized at some point, but only 3 years after I moved out. She called me one day and asked me if I know where the camera is. Yeah, I knew where the camera was because I was using it the whole time, and I told her that, so she gifted me the camera. So here's the question: what was your first camera, and do you still have it? And if you liked this short story time, then I would appreciate a like. And maybe if you want to hear more stories like this about the photography business, then leave a like, consider subscribing. Until next time.